It is the year 502 after the elders left the world. On a field in the south of Rith, the human continent, bodies lie broken, littering the ground with their limbs. A lone soldier clambers through the mess, breathing hard, blood seeping from the deep wound in his chest. Then he spots it, the dark mass of the Vulcan army gathered after a successful battle. When he approaches, the soldiers on the edge are startled until they see the burning mountain emblazoned on his breastplate, black iron with red enamel catching the dying sun. Their own matching emblems mark them as brothers in conquest, the high-collared armor giving each soldier the same intimidating silhouette, layers of segmented plate rippling like cooling lava as they move. Even bloodied and dented from battle, the bronze trim on their armor sets them apart from the dead they've left behind, marking them as the warriors who are reshaping the human lands through iron and fire. "I have a message for the king," he says, the tremor in his voice showing his pain and desperation. King Teshuzili of Volca, Lord of the Rising Peak and voice of the Eternal Flame, looks over his army in satisfaction. For 2 years they have been battling the kingdom of Fekarath, and he is happy with their progress. Fekarath, known for their metal workers, are a key placement in the ultimate goal of the mighty Vulcans, domination of all Rith. He is surprised when the messenger arrives.
Hatu, what are you doing here?
He says.
You are injured.
Hatu bows low, almost collapsing as he does. "Your Highness, I bring grave news." He looks up at his king. "Warlord Villainous has taken your son." Then he falls to the ground, never to rise again. The Vulcan Empire was founded in 450 AE by Teshuzili's grandfather with one aim: to dominate all of human land, bringing it under one rule in the name of Elder Antheron. Every king was a warrior king, and Teshuzili was no different. While his father before him had struggled much of his reign with internal strife, when Teshuzili took the throne as the third king of Volca in 493 AE, he quickly brought the whole kingdom to heel, showing his strength and political skill. He didn't make any major moves for quite a few years into his reign, and then, in 500 AE, he launched an offensive into the lands of Fekarath. Fekarath was a major kingdom of Rith at the time. Established in 407 AE, they were notable for being naturally surrounded by mountains, controlling the mountain passes, and having their settlements in river valleys between. The land was rich in iron and copper deposits also, making its resources and its placement attractive to the ambitious Teshuzili. He took his Vulcan army over the mountains on a grueling journey, losing many, but the Vulcans were bred for war. Despite reduced numbers, upon reaching the lands of Fekarath, they started cutting through the defenders with ease. Teshuzili knew that he wouldn't live forever, but fortunately, he had a son to take his throne like he had taken his father's. His son was Prince Matalun. Deciding the young prince had to learn to be a warrior, Teshuzili took Matalun with him on the campaign, teaching him the ways of war. Matalun was never out of danger, not completely, but his father did take pains to make sure the young prince was away from most of the frontline fighting, often in reserve forces or camps further back while Teshuzili led the main army. This was the situation in 502 AE. The Vulcans had been inching ever closer to the capital of Fekarath, and Teshuzili could taste victory. He was facing the most experienced army Fekarath had ever fielded that day, so had put his son in a camp further back than usual. When the Vulcans met the Fekarath on the battlefield, there was little the defenders could do, but there was more going on than Teshuzili could have ever anticipated. To the west stood a fortress owned by Warlord Villainous. Villainous had risen through violence and blood from an orphan child to lord of what he called the Villainousar region. Very modest he was. However, he was struggling. During his rise, he had not hesitated to kill anyone who even gave him the smallest amount of defiance, and this had led to, when it was all said and done, him not having enough serfs under his rule to work the lands. In other words, he was poor. His army was getting restless, his servants were getting hungry, and he himself was not enjoying the luxury he so badly wanted. Villainous knew the war between Volca and Fekarath was taking both of their undivided attention. but likely coming to an end. He knew from travelers who passed his land that Prince Matalon was there being kept behind the front lines, and most importantly, he knew Volca was wealthy. So the plan he came up with was simple. He sent a small contingent of his soldiers to cross the mountains into Fekarath, and while Teshuzili was busy in battle, Villainous's soldiers attacked the camp that held Matalon. The young Prince Matalon had been 12 years of age when he left his father to enter Fekarath. He had been excited to prove his worth, but was utterly disappointed when still, 2 years later, his father kept him behind. Before the battle on that fateful day in 502, they had argued.
I am almost a man grown,
He had said to his father.
Let me fight by your side. I will show the Vekoraths what a true Prince of Volca...
Enough!
King Teshuzili had said. He placed a hand on his son's cheek.
You are heir to the throne, Matalon. If I lose you, then we lose Volca. You will stay. One day you will lead your own armies into battle and have a son and understand.
After that, Matalon had watched bitterly as his father rode out with bulk of the forces. Normally, a couple hundred would be left with Matalon, but this time it was less than 50, as every man was needed. He was sulking as he smacked his sword into a dummy when Hatu found him. Your form has improved, young master, Hatu said. Matalon turned round angrily.
Then why does father still leave me behind? I can fight. I can bring glory to the Empire.
Hatu smiled. He was a veteran of many battles under Teshuzili, but had been left to command the rear this one time, much to his own dismay. The king knows best, young master. One day you will be king, and you will know best. But for now, you are prince, and are still learning. Matalon huffed and sat on the ground.
When was your first battle, Hatu? Real one.
I was 15, just turned. Your father and I rode out to meet a rebel lord. It was glorious. At Matalon's frustrated look, Hatu patted him on the shoulder. You will get your chance, young master. Then there was a roar. A cacophony of men's voices raised in a battle cry. Hatu and Matalon both jumped up as clashing of steel upon steel could be heard on the wind.
What's happening?
Matalon asked. The only answer Hatu gave was drawing his sword as two men rushed at him, dressed in the purple colours of Warlord Villainous. Hatu met them with the confidence of a Vulcan, parrying their blows with ease, then sidestepping and cutting one down. Before the next one could react, a blade pierced his stomach from behind, and he dropped to the floor. Hatu smiled at Matalon. It seems you get your battle after all. They ran deeper into the fray. Experienced warrior and the young prince fighting side by side, but they were outnumbered. Villainous had expected even more men than the 50 there were, so his forces made quick work of the deed. The Vulcans, ferocious as they were defeated. Hatu was stabbed through the chest and Matalon was taken, kicking and screaming. When the warlord's men had left, Hatu pushed himself to his feet. He knew he didn't have long to live, and as far as he could tell, no one else had survived. He had a choice then: go after the prince and aim to regain his honor, or find the king to warn him of what had happened. Putting the king's need above his own, he chose the second, ready to make the last trip he would ever make. Weeks later, a figure rode a black stallion through the Vulcan army camp. He was covered head to toe in silver plate armor, and a thick helmet covered his face. The Vulcan soldiers watched in awe and whispered amongst themselves as this figure stopped his horse by the tent of King Teshuzili and dismounted. The guards of the tent looked him once over and then led him inside. The Vulcan king had faced endless battle, assassination attempts and betrayal from his closest allies, all with a stiff lip. But his son being kidnapped, now that had affected him. He tried not to show it, for he was leader of the empire, commander of the army, but to the figure in silver armor it was plain to see the king was troubled.
I thank you for coming,
King Teshuzili said after waving the guards out the tent. The silver armored figure said nothing while the king explained the situation. In most cases the king would expect more respect, but this was not most cases. For the person who stood before him in silver-plated armor was the legendary Immortal Knight, the Eternal Warrior, the undead mortal, the man death feared. No one truly can agree who the Immortal Knight originally was. Some say he was the husk of Elder Mortarion, travelling the world defending his people. Others say he is the last Atlarid trying to make up for what they did during the war, and yet others say he was no one at all, a myth made up to entertain children, and rather his deeds we know of were done by multiple different people and conflated together. Either way, according to the Vulcan records, it was the Immortal Knight who stood before the king, and it was the Immortal Knight who the king sent to take back his son. For King Teshuzili was in a difficult situation. He had been away from the Empire for 2 years fighting this brutal war, and although he was winning, the Empire was getting restless. His father had struggled to keep control while on his campaigns, so to mitigate the problem, Teshuzili had left his wife, Queen Luluma, with a medium-sized force of her own to keep the order. The issue was that letters from Luluma had become more sparse and less detailed over the years. Teshuzili felt he might be losing the loyalty of his own wife, and if that was so, he could not allow her or anyone else in the Empire to know what had happened to Metallan. On the other hand, Teshuzili was so close to defeating Fekarath that he could barely spare even a single soldier. The army that he had crossed the mountains with 2 years earlier was the same army he was still fighting with. There had been no reinforcements, no new joiners, and he had been steadily losing men, not just to death, but to keeping the peace in the lands they conquered. He was stretched so thin that any other wise king would have given up long ago. But King Teshuzili was a Vulcan. They did not give up. There was no word for surrender in their language. Warlord Villainous had sent terms to the king. For Metallan's safe return, he wanted 1,000 Vulcan seals, delivered in 10 ironbound chests, each bearing the mountain mark. The gold must be pure and each seal would be inspected for authenticity before the prince's return. The demand to Teshuzili was an insult, one that made him furious beyond words. They were Vulcans. He could not let this dishonor fester, so he called for the Immortal Knight and gave him a task. Whatever was necessary, save his son.
Warlord Villainous stood atop the battlements of his fortress with a sneer on his face. Below him was someone he thought to be a myth, a tale made up by nurses to entertain children. Maybe he'd entertained the idea of the figure existing once or twice in his own thoughts, but never had he expected to have the person himself on a black stallion before his own gates, in gleaming silver armor and holding the severed heads of not one, not two, but 3 of his scouts. The Immortal Knight looked up at the warlord. In his right hand he held a rope. At the other end, the heads were tied together. They had been easy enough to kill, arrogant and slow to react as they were. The Immortal Knight had made quick work of them. He had thought about taking the whole bodies to show Villainous, but he figured just the heads would make his point and be easier to carry. He threw them onto the dirt in front of him.
Bring me the boy and I will leave,
the Immortal Knight shouted. Villainous's sneer widened. Some would have thought it impossible, for it was already pretty wide, but widen it did as his anger bubbled up. The boy the knight spoke of was none other than the Prince of Volca, Metallan. When he had asked for the ransom of 1,000 Vulcan seals, he had not expected the legendary Immortal Knight to turn up demanding the boy back, but there he was. Villainous's sneer then turned into a smile. If he defeated the Immortal Knight, the Vulcan Empire would have to take him seriously. He could up the ransom price even more. He laughed then. He would see if the knight was worthy of his name. "Archers!" Villainous called, and immediately the battlements were lined with his soldiers in purple, holding drawn longbows. "Fire!" The arrows sliced through the air, speeding towards the knight. He whirled his horse around, trying to get away, but it was too late. Although they glanced off his armor, leaving him unharmed, his horse was not so lucky. As the arrows pierced its hide, it let out a wail of anguish and dropped to the ground, pinning the Immortal Knight underneath it. Warlord Villainous laughed again. This was the so-called man that death feared. He turned to the giant of a man standing at his right. He was so tall that his father had claimed his mother had been a giant. That was before the boy named Malvor had killed his father for trying to discipline him as a child. Malvor was a heartless brute, just how Villainous liked them. "Malvor, finish that charlatan." Malvor grunted in acknowledgement, and hoisting his heavy double-sided battle axe, he made his way down. At the front gate, the Immortal Knight was patiently crouched behind his shield as a constant stream of arrows rained down at him. This was not the first time he had been in this situation, not even the 10th time in fact. He knew eventually they would change strategy or run out of arrows. Either way, he was willing to wait. Then they would pay for killing his horse. Oh, and he'd save the boy too. Surprisingly, the arrow stopped far sooner than he had anticipated. He peeked out from under his shield and what he saw pleased him. It was a big man. He loved fighting the big men. They were always so arrogant since in most cases no one had ever been able to stand up to them in their lives. So when they fell, the look on their faces were often oh so sweet. He stood and drew his sword.
I, Malvor, will kill the immortal knight for Lord Villainous.
The one named Malvor shouted and raised his battle axe above his head. A cheer came from the fortress walls. If anyone had been able to see the immortal knight's eyes, they would have seen them roll. See? Arrogant. Malvor charged with a scream and leaped at the knight. He was pretty fast for a big man, but the immortal knight was faster. He ducked the axe strike and shuffled to the side, stabbing his sword into Malvor's armpit in the space between the plates of his armor. As Malvor dropped to his knees, the immortal knight stabbed the so-called son of a giant through the back. Then he turned to look at the sneering warlord.
Is that all you have?
He mocked. He quickly crouched behind his shield again as a barrage of arrows descended upon him. On the battlements, Villainous was furious. He ordered a dozen of his best warriors out the gate. When the arrows stopped, the immortal knight went to work, cutting and slashing and weaving and twirling. Within minutes, all 12 of Villainous's men were dead. The gate opened once again, and this time 30 soldiers were sent to defeat the immortal knight. None survived. Wave after wave of soldiers Villainous sent, each one bigger than the last. And wave after wave the immortal knight defeated, never stopping, never tiring. Meanwhile, within a sparse room of just a bed and a chamber pot, stood Prince Metallon of Volca. The sound of the fighting coming from outside filled him with hope. It must be his father, come to rescue him. The hope, however, was replaced by shame. He was Prince of the Empire, and yet he had allowed himself to be captured. The dishonor that would bestow on him, his father and the royal line would impact them greatly. Not only that, but if his father had left the war with Vekarath, would the Empire even welcome them back? How would they overcome this blight on the family name? He made a vow then. He would do anything to make it up to his father. No matter how disappointed Teshizili was, Metallon would make sure to be a son worth having from this moment on. He knew the door must be guarded, but by how many? Surely it wouldn't be more than 4. Surely he could take them. If he could just attack with surprise and steal one of their weapons, then not even 4 of Villainous's worthless soldiers could overpower him. He went over to the chamber pot and picked it up, grimacing at the smell. He had a plan. He knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again with more urgency.
Hello? Hello?
He heard the sound of a latch and then the door opened, revealing a guard. Metallon didn't even wait. He chucked the contents of the pot at the guard's face and then smashed it into him. The guard reeled back screaming. Metallon launched himself at him, going for the sword, but he was met with an armored fist. He was unconscious before he touched the ground. Back on the battlements, Warlord Villainous sneered wider than he ever had before. 7 waves of soldiers he had sent at the Immortal Knight, and 7 waves of soldiers the Immortal Knight had killed. He stood, calmly, as if on a morning stroll, waiting, looking up at Villainous. The silver helmet still covered his face, but Villainous could sense the disdain. "Send them all," he said. The soldier behind him was confused.
My lord, you mean the whole army?
Villainous rounded on him. "Send them all," he shouted, and the soldier rushed to obey. The Immortal Knight stood and watched as the gates of the fortress opened once again, and outpoured thousands upon thousands of soldiers. He raised his sword and waited for them to come. The shield wall came first, step by step, their pikes pointed forward, as if facing charging cavalry. The Immortal Knight weaved between the weapon points and stabbed in the gaps, felling them one by one. The infantrymen came then, surging forward in a huge mass. The Immortal Knight twirled and slashed, and then a blade nicked him, cutting through the weaker part of his armor at the inner elbow. The soldiers took their chance, leaping and cutting. For every strike that hit the Immortal Knight, he killed 10, yet the strike started to build up. His armor was battered, blood seeped from his body beneath. Then a young spearman, in his first ever battle, struck from behind, piercing the Immortal Knight's neck right through. Not wanting to take any risk, others piled on, hacking and slicing until the Immortal Knight hardly resembled a man, just armor around a jumbled mass of flesh. A cheer went up, and Villainous, despite himself, breathed a sigh of relief. Bring him to me, he ordered before spinning round and marching to his throne room. The soldiers outside picked what was the Immortal Knight up from the ground and carried him into the fortress, the rest filing in afterwards. They had won, they thought, for who could have survived what they had just done to him? Maybe, just maybe, if Villainous had not let his disbelief cloud his judgment and had just paid attention to the name that the knight was known by, his ultimate demise would not have happened. For most, it would have been quite obvious, but not for the prideful Villainous. There was a reason the knight was called Immortal, and Villainous was about to find out why firsthand. Warlord Villainous sat upon his throne of iron and bone, drumming his fingers anxiously against the armrest. The sneer that seemed permanently etched upon his face had faded into something more uncertain. When his men brought in what remained of the Immortal Knight, he rose from his seat, eyes wide. The knight's silver armor was dented, crushed and torn in dozens of places. Blood leaked from every joint, forming a trail across the stone floor. "Is it done?" Villainous asked, his voice unnaturally quiet. The captain nodded, pride evident in his stance. "We did what no one else could, my lord. The Immortal Knight is no more." Villainous approached cautiously, circling the mangled remains. Something felt wrong. The legend couldn't die so easily, could it? Doubt gnawed at him like a rat. "Burn it!" he snapped suddenly. When the captain hesitated, Villainous grabbed him by the collar. "You fool! Burn it now! Every piece! Scatter the ashes in the river! I want nothing left!" The soldiers exchanged nervous glances but obeyed, dragging the knight's remains away to the courtyard. Villainous returned to his throne, but found no comfort there. He sent for Prince Matalin. When the young prince was brought before him, Villainous was surprised by what he saw. Despite weeks of captivity, the boy's eyes burned with a fierce defiance. There was no fear in them, only calculation. "Your father's champion has failed," Villainous announced, forcing his sneer back into place. "The Immortal Knight is dead." Matalin said nothing, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. Villainous leaned forward, enjoying the moment. "Soon I will write to your father again. The price has doubled. 2,000 Vulcan seals. If he refuses..." He left the threat hanging in the air. "My father is a Vulcan," Matalin said finally, his voice steady despite his youth. "And I am his son. We do not surrender." Villainous laughed harshly. "Bold words from a boy in chains," he said before ordering his guards to take Matalin back to his cell. In the courtyard, soldiers had built a hasty pyre. The knight's mangled body lay atop the pile of wood, still encased in the battered silver armor. The captain overseeing the burning looked uncertain. He was not sure whether to take the armor off first, but his warlord had said to burn everything, so he decided best to follow orders exactly. As the first soldier approached with a torch, a hand shot out from the pyre, grabbing his wrist. The soldier barely had time to scream before a blade cut his throat. The Immortal Knight rose from the wood pile in a single fluid motion, pieces of crushed armor falling away to reveal new silver plate beneath. The courtyard erupted into chaos. The captain drew his sword, but the knight's blade took his head before he could lift it. The lieutenant turned to run, but a dagger found his back. Within moments, a dozen soldiers lay dead, and the Immortal Knight stood alone amongst the bodies, breathing calmly as if waking from a pleasant dream. There was no wound on his neck now. No blood leaked from his armor. He rolled his shoulders and looked up at the fortress looming above him, now to find the boy. In his cell, Prince Matalin paced like a caged wolf. 4 steps one way, turn, 4 steps back. He tried to escape once already and failed. His face was still throbbing from the guard's punch, but he would try again. He was the son of King Teshizili, heir to the Vulcan Empire. Failure was not an option. When he heard the commotion outside, he pressed his ear to the door, shouting. The clash of steel. Screams cut short, then silence, more terrible than the noise. He backed away from the door, looking around his sparse cell for anything he could use as a weapon. Nothing but the chamber pot again, and that hadn't worked out so well last time. The door burst open. A figure in silver armor stood silhouetted against the torchlight, blood dripping from his sword.
Prince Matalin?
The voice was muffled behind the helmet, but there was no mistaking the authority in it.
The Immortal Knight.
Matalin whispered, awe overwhelming his usual princely composure.
They said you were dead.
Death and I have an understanding,
the knight replied. He handed Matalin a sword taken from a fallen guard.
Can you use this?
The prince took it with practiced hands, testing its weight.
My father made sure of it.
Good. Stay close. We're leaving.
As they moved through the corridors, the knight's steps were impossibly silent, despite his armor. He would signal for Matalin to wait, disappear around a corner, and moments later beckon the prince forward past freshly dead guards. The young prince's grip on his borrowed sword tightened each time, frustrated that he wasn't given the chance to prove himself.
How many men does Villainous have?
The knight asked as they crouched in an alcove.
Thousands,
Matalin replied.
But they're not loyal. They follow him for gold and fear.
The Immortal Knight nodded. They had almost reached the lower levels when an alarm bell began to ring. Shouts echoed through the stone corridors and the thunder of boots announced that their escape had been discovered. The knight peered down a stairwell and saw guards rushing towards the main gate. It would be blocked.
The kitchens,
Matalin suggested quickly.
There's a delivery entrance. I saw it when they brought me in.
The knight nodded and they changed direction, moving deeper into the fortress. They had just rounded a corner when they came face to face with the patrol. 8 soldiers who looked as surprised to see them as they were to be seen.
Behind me,
the knight ordered, raising his sword. But Matalin didn't move. Instead, he stepped forward, the borrowed sword steady in his hands.
I am Prince Matalin of Volca,
he announced, his young voice ringing with authority that belied his years.
Stand aside or die.
For a moment, no one moved. Then the lead soldier smirked and charged. Matalin didn't hesitate. He ducked the first swing, exactly as he'd been taught, and thrust his blade into the gap between the breastplate and the tasset. The soldier collapsed with a gurgle. The others rushed forward together. What followed was a dance of blood and steel. The Immortal Knight was a whirlwind, his movements so fast they blurred, but Matalin held his own. Every drill his father had forced him to practice, every correction, every lesson, they all came together now when it mattered most. He wasn't as skilled as the knight, but he was a Vulcan prince. He was born for battle. When it was over, 8 more of Villainous's men lay dead, and Matalin stood panting. Blood splattered across his face and clothing. The Immortal Knight looked at him with what might have been respect.
Your father taught you well,
he said simply. They continued toward the kitchens, but the alarm had roused the entire fortress. Twice more they were forced to fight their way through patrols. Matalin felt something changing inside him with each encounter. Fear gave way to focus, desperation to determination. He was no longer a captive boy, but a Vulcan warrior, his father's son in truth. They soon reached the kitchens where servants of the warlord cowered in fear, already scared from the bells. The sight of the blood-covered knight and prince made them scream.
Out!
The Immortal Knight commanded. The servants didn't need to be told twice. They rushed out the door, careful to not touch the warriors. The Immortal Knight grabbed a tub of oil and splashed it across the kitchen as Matalin watched curiously. Once the knight was satisfied, he took a candle and cast it into the liquid. The flame roared up, licking up the walls.
That's for my horse,
the Immortal Knight said before leading Matalin out and toward the service entrance. They saw it, a small wooden door. As the fire raged behind them, they burst out into the sunlight, only to come face to face with Warlord Villainous himself, with dozens of his soldiers behind him. Warlord Villainous's sneer widened impossibly. The Immortal Knight lived up to his name. He supposed he shouldn't be surprised. Then he turned his eyes on the boy.
Prince Matalin,
Villainous called out.
Come to surrender properly? Vulcans do not surrender,
Prince Matalin said.
You kidnapped me, threatened my father, dishonored my house. I will not let such insults stand.
Boy,
the Immortal Knight said warningly, but Matalin stepped forward.
Villainous is mine.
Before the knight could stop him, Matalin rushed towards the warlord, but Villainous drew his sword, an ornate thing with a jeweled hilt that had never seen real battle. Matalin lunged forward, blade seeking the warlord's heart. Villainous parried, surprised by the boy's speed and strength. The Immortal Knight rushed past them, engaging Villainous's soldiers in battle. They were scared, as not long ago they had seen him dead. Their fear spear let him cut through them even easier than he would have usually. They said you were a weak boy, Villainous snarled, swinging his blade in a glittering arc that Metallan barely avoided. Hiding behind your father's armies.
They lied.
Metallan answered, regaining his footing and striking back with a series of quick thrusts that forced Villainous to retreat toward the spreading flames. The warlord was no novice with a blade, but he had grown soft commanding from behind walls rather than leading from the front. Metallan, despite his youth, had the discipline of Vulcan training and the raw determination of one fighting for his honor. The prince pressed forward, his borrowed sword moving with increasing confidence. Villainous stumbled back. Metallan saw his opening and took it without hesitation. The blade slid between the warlord's ribs, finding his heart. Villainous's sneer twisted into shock, and then into nothing at all, as death claimed him. Metallan stood over the body, breathing hard. He felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, only a cold certainty that he had done what was necessary. When he looked up, the Immortal Knight stood beside him. All of the soldiers lay dead. Your first kill? The knight asked.
That matters,
Metallan replied. The knight only nodded. The fire had spread beyond control now, consuming the fortress behind them, orange flames licking up against the sky. In the courtyard, panicked soldiers ran in all directions, some trying to fight the fire, others simply fleeing. None paid attention to the silver-armored knight and the young prince who made their way to the stables. They found 2 horses still in their stalls, wild-eyed with fear of the flames but strong enough to carry them. As they rode through the gates and down the road away from the burning fortress, Metallan looked back once. He thought of the warlord's body being consumed by the fire. It made him smile. King Teshuzili stood on the walls of Fekarath's capital city, watching his Vulcan banners fly from every tower. After 2 years of brutal warfare, the kingdom had finally fallen. He should have felt triumph, but his thoughts were consumed by his son. The Immortal Knight had been gone for weeks with no word. Had the legendary warrior failed? Had Teshuzili lost both his honor and his heir? My king! A scout rushed up the steps to the wall, breathless with excitement. Riders approaching from the west. Teshuzili's heart quickened. How many? Just 2, my king. But one wears silver armor that catches the sun like a mirror, and the other... The scout hesitated. The other appears to be Prince Metallan. The king was moving before the scout finished speaking, descending the steps 2 at a time. When he reached the main gate, his personal guard had assembled, ready to ride out with him. As they passed through the newly conquered city, the Vulcan soldiers lining the streets raised their weapons in salute. Their king barely noticed. They met the riders on the road half a league from the city. When Teshuzili saw his son alive and upright on his horse, something tight in his chest released. He had not wept since he was a small child, but he felt the burn of tears now. Metallan dismounted and dropped to one knee before his father.
Rise,
Teshuzili commanded, his voice rough with emotion.
rise and embrace your father.
When Metallan stood, Teshuzili was shocked by what he saw in his son's eyes. The boy he had left at camp was gone. In his place stood a young man with the steady gaze of one who had faced death and dealt it in return. Teshuzili turned to the silver-armored figure who had dismounted and stood a respectful distance away.
You have my eternal gratitude. Name your reward, and if it is within my power, it shall be yours.
The Immortal Knight shook his head. I require no reward, King of Volca.
Surely there must be something.
Teshuzili pressed.
Gold, land, a position of honor in my court?
What use have I for such things? The knight's voice was distant behind his helmet. I have seen empires rise and fall like the tide. What remains is the deed itself, not the reward for it. Teshuzili studied the knight, wondering at the wisdom and the weariness in those words.
Then at least tell me of my son's rescue. Did you kill this warlord Villainous yourself?
No, the knight replied. That honor belongs to your son. Teshuzili turned to Metallan in surprise. The prince met his gaze steadily. The king placed a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the strength there that had not existed before.
You have made me proud, Metallan, more than you know.
When they turned back to thank the knight again, he was already mounting his horse.
You're leaving?
My task is complete, the knight replied simply.
Where will you go?
The Immortal Knight paused, looking out toward the distant horizon. There is a small hut on the edge of the world where I rest between duties.
Perhaps I will return there for a time. If Volca has need of you again,
Teshuzili asked.
then call and I will answer.
With that, the knight urged his horse forward, riding past the king and prince toward the setting sun. Teshuzili and Matalon watched him go, a silver figure growing smaller against the darkening sky until he was nothing but a glint of light and then nothing at all. As they rode back toward the conquered city of Vekarath, Prince Matalon felt the weight of his future settling upon his shoulders. He was his father's son, a prince of Volca, and he had proven himself worthy of both titles. Behind them, somewhere on the road west, the Immortal Knight rode on, as he always had and always would, until the next time the world had need of him.